Habits and Health, episode 35.
Welcome to the Habits and Health podcast, where we believe creating healthy habits should be easy. Brought to you by an educator and coach for anyone who wants to create a healthier life. Here's your host, Tony Wynyard.
Welcome to another edition of the podcast where we give you ideas on ways you can improve your health. And today's episode, one of the best episodes I think that I've recorded, is with a guy called Pete Williams, who is a functional medicine practitioner. He has a company called Functional Medicine Associates based in London. And I invited Pete on because I wanted to have an expert to talk about the microbiome of the mouth. I think many people are getting to know a lot more about the microbiome of our gut health. But the microbiome of the mouth isn't something that most people are aware of. And it's something I wasn't aware of until a couple of months ago. And as I've learnt more about it, I realised there just was a lack of information around them. And it's something that is so important and it is really would be helpful to so many people if they knew more about it. Pete is a real expert in this, and we'll hear a lot more about his expertise and how that came about during this episode. We also dig into what is functional medicine and integrative medicine and behaviour science and many other areas, and how he sees medicine developing over the next few years. And it's, as I said, it's a really fascinating episode, maybe one of the best episodes that I've done in the 3 years I've been doing this podcast. So really hope you enjoy this episode. Sit back and enjoy with Pete Williams, a functional medicine practitioner in Harley Street in London. Habits and Health. My guest today is Peter Williams. How you doing, Pete?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really glad you're here because as I was mentioning to you before we started recording, I thought I'd love to have an episode on about the microbiome of the mouth, because it's something that when I mention it to people, they go, what's that? A lot of people are now hearing about the microbiome in the stomach and so on, but the mouth, it seems that most people aren't familiar with this at all. And I know it's something that you're quite familiar with, to say the least.
Yeah, that's right. Do you want me to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, go on. Why not?
Well, look, I think, I suppose that probably the best place to start is getting an understanding of who we are as humans. And I think that's a really good place to start, because if we look at how we're made up purely from a cellular perspective and the amount of cells, is that humans are actually slightly more bacterial than human cells. And so the term in medicine that we use for that is holobiont. And what holobiont is defined as is different species occupying the same vehicle or body for the greater good of all. Right. And that is what a human is that, we carry on every sort of surface bacteria. And they want to live in a really nice house and a really nice home. And so what they do for us is they try to protect us. And so, again, when we're dealing with patients and we're talking about microbiome and bacteria, the first thing, we have to understand is that purely from the amount of cells, humans are slightly more made up by bacteria than they are human cells. So in a very simple term, when you're understanding, well, why do people get sick, is that one of the fundamental questions that we ask in our practice is that maybe actually their bacteria aren't in as good a shape as we would like. And therefore, if they're not, they can't do the job that they need to do for us, and that's help us, protect us. And therefore, you're going to get sick. So I suppose that leads us into understanding where most of this bacteria lies, and that's in the gastrointestinal tract. What's really interesting about the gastrointestinal tract, it is just a hollow tube. So, how we look at it from an anatomy perspective is that it's actually it's not inside the body, because obviously when we're looking at what is inside the body is that, if we pulled your gastrointestinal tract, which starts at your mouth and ends at your bum, if we pulled it, we'd be able to see all the way through it. It was a hollow tube, but it's an incredibly important tube, because in what we've learned is that this is where humans fundamentally talk and have to protect against the outside world. Right. And so this is why you've heard the the lines that 70% of your immune system resides the gastrointestinal tract? And the answer to that, it absolutely does. And that is because that huge surface area, which is bigger than a doubles tennis court, if we pulled it apart, is where we're interfacing and talking to the outside world. And we've got this huge border force predominantly made up by bacteria that are literally second by second, minute by minute in this engaged in this war of such enormous numbers from a point of view of bacteria and what they've got to defend against, that it's incomparable. The point about this is that this is where we start to hear about the microbiome and what the microbiome is, and that predominantly, is usually talking about, our small intestine and our large intestine, where most of these bacterial species reside. And we think there's actually, there's some reports that there's probably around about 2 to 3 pound in physical weight of bacteria that are residing in our gastrointestinal tract. But one of the key battlegrounds, of course, is the mouth, and why certainly ourselves as a practice have spent quite a lot of time looking at that and researching that, and actually developing some testing and some courses around that, is because, number one, it's the first port of call where humans, in a sense, start to interact with the outside world and start to defend that from the outside world, and also have this capacity to start deciding what they're going to do with, in particular with food, is this friend or foe, etc. And so that starts in the mouth. And what we're learning about the mouth is that it has the second most diverse microbial density and species, only second to what we're seeing in the gastrointestinal tract. What we've also got to consider is that the mouth is really not separate from the small intestine, the large intestine, and the colon. And it is that first port of call where some of the major battles of how humans defend against the outside world reside. And so we've been as a group really interested in, what some of the newer mechanisms that we're understanding in medicine that can make people sick or can be very much associated with increased risk of pretty much all chronic disease. And that is really about how humans, how they are as a host, and that is about the genes and how people can have different gene variants and whether that's good or bad. But importantly, how we're going to respond to what I like to say, soldiers on the battlefield, which comes into the sort of understanding of the microbiome of the mouth, but importantly, some of what we call the periodontal pathogens, certain groups of bacteria that can actually be quite destructive to humans and go on to lead them down the line of gum disease, periodontal disease. And there's many reasons why we got into this, and I'll go into that in more detail. But I just want to give you some of obviously we have a chronic disease practice, a functional medicine practice in central London. And we have to follow the science, and there's some really disturbing science that comes out to show. There's a recent one done in 2018 in looking at US populations, and what we're finding is that over 50% of the US population over 30 years of age has some form of gum disease. So it's huge, and what we're learning from that is that what stays in the mouth doesn't. So what happens in the mouth doesn't stay in the mouth, and what we're seeing is that if some of these bacterial pathogens have the ability, that they use the word translocate, so have the ability to move from the mouth to distal sites of the body, whether that is the brain, whether that is the joints, whether that is the arteries, then we're going to see these very much increased risk of problematic associations with every single chronic disease. So we're very much interested in, number one, the microbiome of the mouth, understanding whether that in any one individual is in good shape or bad. We're very much interested in testing for and looking at are there any major pathogenic bacteria there? And of course, if there are, what are the numbers? Then we're really interested in, well, how does the host respond to potential pathogens, and what is the sort of immune signature of this individual, and what are the consequences of that? Because again, these run into some of the mechanisms that we're understanding about what can cause and accelerate chronic disease, whether it's obesity, type 2 diabetes, whether it's Alzheimer's. I mean, the Alzheimer's research is horribly scary. And that is, again, is this aspect of understanding that when you have a barrier breach, as you do with gum disease, and that might be, a bit of gum recession, teeth bleeding. It might be actually more advanced where you're starting to lose your teeth because you've got periodontal disease. And again, we know that 50% of the adult population in the UK over 40 will have some degree of established periodontal disease. You've got a barrier breach. And so that means that the chances of some of these pathogenic bacteria slipping through that barrier breach inside the body is going to be problematic. And when that happens, those bacteria can travel to many, many places. I'll give you an example. Despina, who's one of our associates, she did last year did a research degree at King's College, really looking at a pathogenic bacteria in the mouth called Fusobacterium nucleatum. And what we've learned on that one is that bacteria has been found in breast cancer tumours. Now, it's crazy, isn't it, to think, well, how does an oral bacteria end up being part of the puzzle of someone's breast cancer? And the reality of that is that bacteria is translocating through borders that have been breached and ending up there. And when that bacteria gets there, the immune system in the breast starts to say, you definitely shouldn't be here. You're not normal. And then, of course, when the immune system responds, it responds with inflammation, it responds with oxidative stress, and with that immune activation that causes not only localized damage, but slightly more systemic damage. And that's one of the major principles that we're learning to understand about when bacteria have the opportunity to translocate to different areas. And so we really got into this. I got into this personally because at 45, 7 years ago now, I always had great teeth. Tony, visited the dentist twice a year and the hygienist, had a little bit of gum recession, but always told I had great teeth. Started having a problem with a back tooth. Went to the dentist, who I'd been going for years, and she said to me, well, Mr. Williams, that back tooth's going to have to come out. And I said, well, okay, it's fair enough. I've got pretty great teeth. So, why is it? And she says, well, you do have pretty established periodontal disease. And so not only was that a shock from a point of view of someone who works in, I suppose in integrated medicine, never wants to be told they've got a disease. I was just shocked because, Tony, I really didn't have a good understanding at all about what periodontal disease was. And that's been our 7-year journey to become really quite specialized and really good at understanding, well, what are the implications from this? And I think what that revealed to me, of course, I remember leaving that dental appointment, huffing and puffing home, thinking, I've got no idea what this is. And of course, your first port of call is straight onto PubMed. And really sort of delving into the literature. And that just completely opened the rabbit hole because all the literature is there and has been around for 30, 40 years. And that was the understanding of, wow, the periodontal disease is a local disease that has very systemic effects. And so I look back at all those patients that I've had, over the past decade where I'd done a good job, but maybe it wasn't a perfect job. And I didn't even ask the question about, their dental health and get an understanding of that. And so that is something that we do now as just standard of care when people come in to see us, because the relationships are so profound that we cannot ignore it. And hence why it's been so important for us we've actually wanted to really understand that host microbe relationship. And we've gone on to develop a genomics panel with a genetics company because we're so keen on making sure that we understand what the battle looks like for this patient and how we can manipulate that battle so that we can keep everything calm. If we reduce the bacterial load in the mouth, then we reduce the risk of, implications in chronic disease. And, for a practice that deals with obesity, type 2 diabetes, with autoimmunity, with, early stage dementia, this is absolutely crucial that we're onto this and asking our patients this based on the literature. And so, that's why for us, and again, I know we're talking about the oral microbiome. I don't see it as separate, but, we definitely change the way we speak and think about our patients now. Because again, we see many patients who have been really well looked after conventionally. You look at what people come to our practice, and they've been to see many people before, and those people have done a really great job. But maybe they just didn't ask certain questions. And for us, sometimes many really sick people are sick because their microbes are sick. Right. The bacteria are not in the best of shape. And that question's not even been asked or thought about. And so sometimes we just see people who have multisystemic dysbiosis, and that can be ear, nose and throat, that can be mouth, that can be small intestine, large intestine, colon, that can be vaginally. We see a lot of that. The urinary tract, again, we're moving into this area now that every single part of your body has some kind of microbe family there, groups there, species there. And so, we always think about that. We always come back to that fundamental point that you are more bacterial than human cells. And so we've got to at least explore that side. And of course, exploring what is happening in the mouth is really crucial for us. And so that's, as you say, that's what we've gone on to explore. And it's really opened a new world for us. It's opened a new world with dentistry, which again, what's exciting about that is that I think there's a change in dentistry because they can't ignore the science. They can't ignore the science of how important their role is with regards to chronic and systemic disease. I mean, I almost feel as though, I use the line that, maybe going to the dentist is as important as going to the gym, because I think that, that you could look at the literature and go, if I've got poor dental health, the detrimental health outcomes that may come from that are as bad as not doing any exercise. Yeah. And so, I also find it unfortunate because it's another situation, it's another rabbit hole that we never thought about, and we're going to have to. And this comes back to, almost the simplest aspects of you're going to need to start cleaning your teeth well, and you're going to need to think about your diet, and you're going to need to think about everything else that goes with that. Because if you get that wrong, you're going to be accelerating some of the chronic diseases. And so we did a really brilliant case study. Myself and a dentist called Dr. Victoria Sampson. We did this we had this rheumatoid arthritis patient who wasn't getting any better. Actually had been to see a really great functional medicine clinician who had done a really good job systemically looking at this patient. But her rheumatoid was getting worse, not better. A lot of her inflammatory markers were getting worse, not better. And through no fault of this clinician's, and again, 7 years ago, I'd probably been in the same situation. He just never asked her about her dental health. And of course, this is a patient with really quite advanced periodontal disease. And so for me, it was the complete, you know what? When she came in to see us, I said, look, I think the elephant in the room here is your dental health. And we've really got to get on top of that because of the relationship with rheumatoid arthritis and periodontal disease. Very strong relationship with both of them. And we need to get on with it. But we need a dental expert who thinks the same way that we do and understands what I require. And so we did, and we did a really great job. And pretty much within 16 weeks, we had put her rheumatoid almost into remission, where she just isn't a patient that believes she has rheumatoid arthritis anymore, which is fantastic. So we're not getting any more flares with it, and if she does flare, she doesn't feel them, or her inflammatory markers are all down. Now, does that mean that patient is always going to really have to do the work that she did and continue to do the work because her mouth is so compromised? that, the battlefield is always raging and the if you like, the barrier breaches are always there because of where she is? The answer to that is yes. But I think what we did is that we looked at that and showed how quickly that we can remiss someone's disease that is not associated or not normally associated with what is happening in the mouth. And we were very lucky to actually present that case study at quite a large conference a few months ago. So we know we're on the right tracks with this, and we know we've got a sort of a process and a strategy where, any chronic disease, you've got to be thinking about that bigger picture, and importantly, having that thought about, just asking the question, how good is your dental health, and what do you need to do, because it really is that important. And I think if there's any real simple message from here is that understanding that you clean your teeth correctly and you use flossing and you go to a dental hygienist and you go to a dentist is really quite crucial, particularly if you have family history of susceptibility to losing your teeth, etc. The likelihood is we're going to see a patient that is more genetically susceptible in the mouth on that side. So that's how we got into it.
There's so many questions going through my mind after what you've just said. And one of the things that I'm thinking is it very much sounds like there should be a much closer working relationship between whatever doctor a patient has and a dentist a patient has. There should be a much closer working relationship between, or passing information at least, between a doctor and a dentist.
Yeah. And I would say that has been a struggle. I think it continues to be a struggle. And I think we've got to be very selective about the dentists that we use on that, because there's no point us going to a dentist. And it's really, again, Tony, I think this is just, I suppose you've got two sides of medicine. And, what I'm not going to do is slag off where we are with conventional medicine, because I've been in the health industry long enough to know that humans and human health is so vastly complex, is that you could spend your life in a very blinkered section of medicine and never ever need to look out of that because it's so vast. So I understand that. And I also understand for dentistry that it's almost like, holy cow, well, my role is only to do what's in the mouth and not to worry about anything else that goes on systemically. So I understand that as well. But I think where I think the field is changing, and I rather hope that the training that we've built, the genomics tests that we've done, and is encouraging dental hygienists and dentists to be able to have some degree of being able to step into that area to get that understanding about, how do we work together with this? How do we, not only solve what is happening in the mouth, but go some way to help this patient's medical condition, and also sort of inform dentistry that, is your patient coming in? Is your patient a type 2 diabetic? Is your patient a rheumatoid arthritis patient? And what is the association with what's happening in the mouth there? And try and connect that up. I believe that it's happening much more than it was. And I do believe that over time, this will become more and more normal. As people just... And I say that is because it comes down to fundamentally, you cannot ignore what the science is telling us. And the science always guides us, is to say, wow, I mean, these relationships aren't just a little bit associated. And they are just, the numbers are huge. So, and a lot of these now are pointing to direct causal mechanisms. I think, if you look at the research group at Texas Tech, the research group at Vanderbilt in the US, they consistently have written papers looking at how bacterial pathogens are translocating into your arteries and being a direct causal mechanism in cardiovascular disease, which again is changing the way that we are understanding how humans get cardiovascular disease. And how everything all gets lumped into that. And, so how we're looking at how humans get cardiovascular disease now is completely different of, what we thought it was just, cholesterol and lipids, 50 years ago. It's completely different. Mm-hmm. And one of those mechanisms, one of those arms of that is when you have a pathogen that has got into a place that it shouldn't do, your immune system tags it and goes to war with it and doesn't discriminate. And when the immune system attacks, it attacks with chemical warfare, it attacks with inflammation, it ramps up oxidative stress, and they all create this peripheral damage. And that's the thing we've got to think about. And so, even again, when we're talking about cardiovascular disease, you can see adverse lipid profiles on people that are down to infections in their mouth. And so, again, it's this deeper and deeper understanding with regards to, well, what's causing what? And how do we stop that? And so this is why when we come back to fundamental basics and trying to tell our patients, how do we dress this up in the story? It is the story of the battlefield. It is the story about, you've got to have, when we're talking about microbiome and the microbiome of the mouth, is that in general, you want to have more good guys than bad guys. You want to keep that ratio. And also we want to understand whether we've got an individual that has an immune system that is, and again, I think this is one of the other things of understanding about humans. And I say particularly with COVID and slightly going off here is that most of the COVID patients who have had the more severe complications of COVID are the ones who tend to have the more aggressive immune systems. So the immune system, you don't need to build a stronger immune system with them. You actually need to make sure that you're calming their immune system down. Yeah. And so these are the things that we're learning. Again, periodontal disease and inflammatory diseases like that are usually from an immune system that's actually a little bit too good at doing its job. It's a little bit too aggressive and actually needs calming. So what I like to say to our patients is, look, what you want your immune system like is the 50-year-old bouncer who controls the outside of the club. He's had 25 years of what happens outside. So he knows that the first year students at the local university, all right, they've had a few too much to drink and probably, causing a little bit of strife outside the club, but they're not really going to be problematic. And so you're not going to need to overreact. But of course, the new bouncer who's 22, hasn't had that experience, that's the one who's likely to overplay. And so again, this relationship that we understand with bacteria, and this relationship we understand with barrier breaches, and what are the complications and the consequences of bacteria that move to other places. And again, you name it, joint surfaces, breast tissue, very much one of the areas I'm interested, which is brain. And again, if we're looking at what we're understanding with the Alzheimer's research, a lot of the proteins that give us a determination of Alzheimer's, and just to be clear, is that you can't get a true definition of Alzheimer's while a patient's alive. You can only say it's suggestive of Alzheimer's. We're learning that these proteins that eventually cause the Alzheimer's are actually the brain's immune system trying to protect the brain against invaders. And the brain has this blood-brain barrier. So it's a bit like another castle wall, a bit like the mouth. And that castle wall has to be monitored, and that castle wall has to be guarded. And of course, you've got to have pathways where you're allowed to come in to deliver things that the brain wants, but also take things out. So if you've got a blood-brain barrier that has been compromised, this is where you start to see some of these oral pathogens getting into the brain. And as you say, we're quite hot on that. There's one in particular, an oral pathogen called Porphyrovirus gingivalis, which creates a lot of problems, not only on the blood-brain barrier, but within the brain. And so the Alzheimer's research, I'm not saying it's changing, but it's very much thinking about, well, is Alzheimer's a disease that is genetically led and lifestyle led, which there's a strong component of that, but also is Alzheimer's a disease where there is a barrier breach, and while that barrier is consistently breached, things will come in that shouldn't be there, and your brain is having to try and make these protective proteins to defend against the brain, which it does. The problem with that long term is that becomes the problem. And so these are all the interesting aspects of how we try to deal with patients and try to get that understanding of the mouth. So if we have a patient, again, maybe it's a patient who's showing cognitive decline, and one of the major questions that we will ask and test for is what's happening in the mouth. And we'll want to absolutely have a bacterial profile there of potential pathogenic bacteria, because we know that relationship is so strong. And what we also know is the barrier in the mouth, the barrier in the gastrointestinal tract, the blood-brain barrier are very similar structures. They might not be the same, but how I try to explain that is that imagine they're all castles. They might not look the same, but they are all castles. And so how they're structurally set up, how a lot of the proteins that protect them are quite similar. So what we've learned on the literature, if you've got a barrier breach somewhere, the mouth or the gut, you are increasingly likely you're more likely to have a barrier breach at the brain. Right. And so when you start getting, a patient that has, oral health problems, has gut problems, and then you're seeing all these sort of neurocognitive issues as well, you start to think, okay, how much of that is down to barrier breaches? And do we need to think about that? And do we need to test for that? So it really, again, continues to bring us down to how important keeping good dental health is. And I mean, I know it in particular because, as I said to you, I am one of those susceptible individuals. I'm one of those susceptible genotypes. And so you've got to work really hard. I have to work really hard and I've done an absolutely fantastic job of reversing my periodontal disease. But I'm always susceptible to it. Right. And I'll always be susceptible to it. It's just the way it is. The genetics dictate that. Various other aspects dictate that. So I've got to work really hard on that aspect to not only reduce that risk, but also reduce some of the other risks from a point of view of the other chronic disease aspects. And so again, very much interested in this area, but it does become another one of those rabbit holes that you weren't aware of, and now you are, and you think, God, are we ever going to get to the stage where, we know enough? I think the answer to that is absolutely not. There's going to be something else that comes up that, again, means you've got to think about your patient in a very different way again.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of the Habits and Health podcast, where we believe creating healthy habits should be easy. If you are looking for deep support to create the health and life you want, we invite you to consider one-on-one coaching sessions with Tony. Coaching sessions give you personalised guidance to fit your unique goals and life situation. Only a limited number of spots are available, but you can easily get started by booking a free introductory call at tonywynyard.com. Now back to the show.
Before we started recording, you talked about, you've been in functional medicine, integrative medicine for, what was it? I think you said 20 years now? And
22 years now. Yeah.
And in that time, you've seen the increase in the number of people operating this way in the UK. And I'm wondering, is it the same slow increase in people, in dentists who take that kind of functional approach as well?
Yeah, so I look at I think there are some really quite established organisations in dentistry. One would be Mercuryfree dentistry, and again, I think it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, again, whatever your thoughts on that, and again, one of the reasons why we wanted to do the oral DNA panel is that we wanted to include susceptible genotypes to mercury. Whilst I fundamentally believe that no one should have mercury amalgams in their mouth, it's not as simple as that. And so this is one of the key aspects of why we tried to work with some of the key mercury-free dentists to get that understanding that there are lots of nuances that go with having a person who is healthy enough to maybe go through the extraction process. The extraction process has to be done very much in a certain way, because if it's mercury amalgams are removed in an inappropriate way, that can definitely trigger off a whole host of issues. But yes, I think there are some well-established organizations, but I feel as though there is that new wave of dental, and whether you call it the mercury-free dentist or the biological dentistry side, where they're trying to think, we can't just put fillings in, we can't just choose a material to put back in someone's mouth that maybe again creates an autoimmune response. We need to think maybe differently about root canals, because again, the evidence with regards to root canals becoming infective and causing problems, again, I think is pretty well known, and yet we still do it. And so I think there is definitely a groundswell on that. And Tony, it comes down to, as I said at the beginning, there comes a point where you cannot ignore the science. And so you've either got to make a decision to ignore it or making a decision to go with it. What I appreciate is it's hard to go with it, because you're going to have to accept that you're going to have to go down a pathway that maybe is different than you were before. And it's harder because you've suddenly got to think about a lot more scenarios with your patient. It's no longer, I'm just going to do the mouth and worry about that. It is a question, well, what are the consequences of what I've just done? And can I be speaking to other people who can refer into me, who understand what I want to do and what I need to do, but also I can be told a lot more about what needs to be done from my side. So one of the key things that I'm taught to do, again, I've got a strong relationship with Dr. John Roberts, who's one of the certainly world-leading dentists in biological dentistry. And we've been having these conversations for 2 to 3 years with regards to making more secure links with dentistry. And absolutely, I think it's got to happen. But of course, again, the key thing is that, it's a bit like functional medicine. I'm not going to say it's posh medicine, but it is unfortunately in a situation where it is not medicine for the masses, because obviously well-trained clinicians are going to cost a lot of money. And not only that, it's, you take a patient on a journey back to wellness that could be 18 months. And so, unfortunately, biological dentistry is going to be the same. But the evidence is there. I think just on some absolute, basics is, and I think if we take you back to the mercury aspects, it's a bit crazy really that we've put such a toxic material in some people's mouths and expect it not to have an impact somewhere. And so part of our genomics panel was to try and identify the canaries in the coal mine from a point of view of mercury, because I was always keen to get an understanding. And we have many patients who come to me and say, should I have my mercury amalgams out? And my key for me is to go, well, number one, do we know that these mercury amalgams are affecting the patient? I think we don't. But, are we seeing signs and symptoms of something that could look like mercury poisoning over time? And how do we look at that and how do we test for that? But are we looking at a patient where they may have susceptible genetics to both exposure to mercury and then, of course, mercury detoxification? And then, of course, what we don't know is where does the mercury go? Because obviously every time you have a cup of tea or hot materials, you're going to create some degree of mercury vapor from that filling. And so there's lots and lots of nuances. I don't understand it all by any means. I don't think anyone does. But what I've always wanted to do is be able to give my patients a more informed opinion with regards to mercury amalgams and their health, for sure. I would never advise some patient, get them all out without really having done some decent due diligence on them. And that's what I've tried to do with regards to the add-on to one of the tests that we've made. We want to look at some of the known gene variants that are associated with problems with mercury. So if you've got a patient who's incredibly sick, you've got a patient that has all the symptoms, associated symptoms of mercury overload. If you have a patient that has susceptible genotypes that you can test for, then you're bringing them more to a degree of clinical certainty that, this might be a smart thing to do. And then you just got to organize when to do it with the appropriate people. So yes, I think, and again, I this brings us back to the question: is do I believe that much of the problem with people is that we just live in an incredibly toxic world? Absolutely. And I think anything that you can daily detoxify. And again, I want to be careful with using the terminology, because I'm not a guy who says, yeah, go and do green juices every morning. There's nothing wrong with green juices, of course, but that's not going to solve your detoxification issues. And again, so being toxic, I think we've got to be very careful with the terms that we use, because again, it would be, well, what do you mean by that? How do we measure it? And then what can we do about it? And so we've got to not use our terms loosely. But so that's why we've tried to be more and more clear. It's almost like build clinical certainty, almost like a clinical certainty tree, that we're giving our patient as much information as what we understand, that, yeah, that might be a smart thing to do. But I think timing is also crucial on that as well, is that I'm not keen on detoxifying people who are inherently sick, unless it's the last sort of gasps that they've got, because any detoxification process is incredibly energy dependent. So you've got to be careful with certain people. And of course, the detoxification process can make a lot of people much sicker. So it's not something that you can go into lightly, although, if you looked on the internet, you looked on the thing, everyone seems to be doing it. And, and maybe that's just a use of terminology. But it comes down to fundamentally, you've got to do the basics well. I mean, and even on that, I mean, people don't, just a simple example is people don't sweat anymore. It's like, well, when's the last time you sweat? Well, I don't sweat. So what, is that because you're not exercising, or you're not exercising enough? No, just you think, wow, okay, well, that's definitely a detoxification route that we want to try and organize. Or, people are not going to the toilet. Is another aspect where we think on a very basic level, forget everything you've been told. Let's just get your bowels moving, and then we'll worry, and that will help us to, decrease your toxic load, and because your systems are working a bit better. So again, lots of nuances around that.
Just going back to something you said probably about earlier on in the episode about people really need to take, it's very important to take care of the mouth, and with regular cleaning and flossing and so on. So if anyone who's now maybe concerned that they're not doing enough, what would you say would be a good routine for taking care of the mouth?
So I would say that the most important thing is, as you say, going to the hygienist and a dentist, for me, is as important as keeping yourself fit. It's the new gym.
Right.
And so there's your starting position, is that making the connection that dentistry is an incredibly important aspect to your systemic health. Right. And so you need to be attending the dentist and the dental hygienist regular. It's the mistakes I made. As I say, is that I never recognized the importance of it. So that would be the number one, is that let's go and get a baseline. Let's go and speak to your dental hygienist and get an indication of where you're at. The second thing then is what do you do on a daily basis? And that is that you probably need to start spending more attention with regards to how you clean your teeth, when you clean your teeth, and what else do you do? Are you using, floss, or are you using interdentals? And that would be the absolute basics of where you would start. And in many ways, it's a bit laughable, really, is that we've built all this program, we've built all this training, and sometimes you just need to have a test for an individual to go, and that's why you really need to start cleaning your teeth well every day. So people come to us expecting, that because we're quite an established practice, that we're going to do all this sort of super cool testing, and that's going to reveal everything, Tony. And there's no doubt we can do that. But it still comes back to, before you spend all your money, let's get some fundamentals that you are doing the fundamental basics well. Yeah. And because that is where you're going to get the biggest results, the biggest bang for your buck on this journey. Do the fundamental basics well. Get in contact with your dentist. Go and see the hygienist, because that physical daily removal is so crucial. Because, what the plaque is plaque and tartar on your teeth is an established biofilm. It is an established city of bacteria. And bacteria, they've been on this planet much, much longer than we have. So they are incredibly smart. And when they find a nice place to live, like on teeth or below the gum margins, they start doing this thing called quorum sensing. What that means is they start going, hey, we're building a really great house here. Do you want to come and live in our community? And so all these other bacteria start going, yeah, that sounds great, and start living with it. So this is why being physical removal of plaque is so important, because you're moving these really tough residual houses that your bacteria have built. And it's an ongoing process. And unfortunately with teeth, why teeth it's so difficult with teeth is that they don't shed. So teeth are teeth. They don't renew. They are what they are. And that's where, your mouth actually has a much thicker layer than the gastrointestinal tract. But its weakness is always where the teeth are, because that gives you the entrance potentially below the gum line and also the entrance for bacteria into the body. And so the physical removal of those are so important from that. And then you could get into, making sure that, again, over time, that the diet becomes more and more prominent. You are eating, again, very much a sort of Mediterranean style diet that has lots of these phytochemical compounds, these polyphenols that actually change the health of the microbiome in the mouth. And therefore, in very simple terms, you're generating more good guys than bad guys. You're offsetting that. So again, this is where various aspects of diet matter. I think there's lots of evidence now coming out with regards to mouth breathing and understanding the importance of trying to breathe in a different way, not so much from a mouth breather. And we're definitely seeing evidence of people who are mouth breathing at night, and you'll see this much more in type 2 diabetics, in patients that have a tendency to more overweight. Then they're more susceptible to having changes in the microbiome in the oral microbiome, from a point of view of, you're going to change that environment, that there's more likely to be bad guys there. And so it really is, do some of the fundamentals first and then think about the sort of secondary that needs to go behind that. But it always comes back to basics for me. I think people think, as you say, yes, we can do tens of thousands of pounds worth of testing, all well and great, but it comes down to the basics. Are you doing the basics well? And if you're not, why is that? And again, we talked at the beginning, is that sometimes because they have unconscious behaviors that they don't know they're doing. And you've got to get on top of those over time as well.
Well, I want to get into that in just a minute. But before we get into that, I'm wondering about mouthwash and the microbiome. And also, you talked about mouth breathing, and how detrimental is mouth breathing to the bacteria in the mouth as well?
It's a really good question. I think on what and this is again new to me, and this was just exposed to me by working with some of these dentists, is that if you use my example, who is always desperately, I eat a good diet, I exercise a lot, I'm doing all the right things, and yet, I'm a genetically susceptible person to periodontal disease. But, the dentists are starting to think for me, and they've had a look at the way my structure, my jaw is, and my windpipe, and we've done all these x-rays, and they potentially believe that some of my problems are because maybe I mouth breathe at night. And so they are absolutely clear that the more you mouth breathe, the more potential you have that you're changing the microbiome within the mouth. Right. So it does seem to be problematic, yes.
And the mouthwash question.
So the mouthwash question, again, I think there's a few nuances around this. There are certain mouthwashes that contain certain chemicals. One of them is called chlorhexidine. That actually it has a potential to wipe out a lot of the bacteria on the back of the tongue. Again, remember, every place will have a microbial group that are sort of doing things. And what we've learned on that is that and it was actually an English study about 4 years ago, showed that the bacteria on the back of the tongue, if affected by mouthwashes that have chlorhexidine in, can actually change the way these bacteria change nitrates from foods. So we have all these foods. Beetroot would be a really good example. that produce these nitrates. And what those bacteria do is they start the process of changing nitrate into nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide in the body in good levels is incredibly valuable, particularly from a point of view of vascular tension, arterial tension. And what we know is that nitric oxide becomes this incredible sort of protective gas for the arteries and the cardiovascular system. And of course, if you're eating foods and trying to get the nitrates on it, and you've disturbed the bacteria that do that, then the evidence suggests that you're going to potentially have increased blood pressure. So yes, I think is that every time we put chemicals in our mouth, we have to think about whether that chemical has an association with potentially changing the microbiome. So the more we go away from food as Mother Nature and Grandma wanted us to eat, I think the potential increased risk exists from that perspective.
So are there safe mouthwashes?
There's so many. Again, there has been an explosion of dentistry products that are associated with helping the oral microbiome, with helping, and particularly fluoride. Again, fluoride is another argument, and there are. So again, there's a big argument about fluoride. There's no doubt that fluoride reduces dental cavities. No doubt about that. But are there alternatives to fluoride that show up just as well? I think the answer to that is yes. We're seeing a lot of the research over the last 20, 30 years from Japan, looking at a bone compound called hydroxyapatite. And so there are lots of, integrative dentistry products now that are sort of saying, well, fluoride is fundamentally designed for this. We know our product is natural. It has no side effects or potential side effects. And it stacks up against fluoride. So why wouldn't you use it? Well, I know that the difficulty with this is, of course, they cost a lot more. And there's sort of some brilliant products that we use that are herbal related for some brilliant companies that clinically give us incredible outcomes. But again, they're expensive. So, if money's not an object, then those products are out there. There are oral microbiome mouthwashes that you can take at night. Again, great products, make a lot of sense. They're looking, and almost what you're looking at is you're identifying the sort of the good bacteria that goes to war with the potential pathogen. And so what these companies are doing is that we know these bacteria or these bacterial groups actually will go and dislodge or displace or kill these other groups. And so, you're getting a lot of oral probiotic products that are being built now. And I've used them all. I have an oral mouthwash at night. There's a probiotic that, again, swill it around my mouth for a minute, swallow it then, so I get the benefits of it, down the gastrointestinal tract. They seem to work. So there's absolutely loads of companies starting to enter this space. Again, I bring you back to why are they entering the space? Is because the science is there.
Right.
And so whilst you're going to get the naysayers, while you're going to say that's not correct, you can always go back, say, well, where are you coming from? Because the science is here to suggest that this product is as good, if not better, than fluoride, and we don't have to worry about any potential toxic side effects to that.
Right.
So the world's changed on that side. But the only thing I would say, but they do cost more.
Yeah.
And there's always a sort of cost implication to anything that we do. It's a bit like, regular dentistry trips. It's going to cost you a bit more. But how much more of that trip is being associated with a point of view of this might have been for susceptible individuals one of the most important things that they can do for their ongoing health.
Right.
And so that's where you identify the susceptible individuals. It's a bit like that rheumatoid arthritis patient, is that her biggest thing to protect her health going forward, to keep her rheumatoid pretty much in remission, is that she's on top of going to see the dentist that I wanted to see on a 3-monthly basis, so that we know we've got everything under control and we're calm on that. It allows me to do my job much, much easier as well. So you start to get an individual where you can identify with an individual what is the most important place for you to spend your money on your health. And so again, I think that is understanding that well allows you to really individualize and personalize that patient's program on that side.
You touched on behavioural science just now, and you know, we before we started recording, we were talking about when you first became a functional medicine practitioner and how much you've learned since then about the importance of behaviour and so on. So, and I thought it was fascinating what you said. Could you maybe talk about that?
So, yeah, I think there's I wonder what sometimes patients come in and they have an indoctrination with regards to how medical care should be. So I think whenever a patient comes in, you have to understand where the biases are coming from. And I don't mean that in a horrible way, but if you've only known the dentist and the NHS, you're indoctrinated to that. Well, this is how medicine works. When patients come to us with chronic diseases that have been there for a very long time, we try and always make sure our patients understand why they've arrived, and that will be because they will have genetic susceptibilities that have been exaggerated based on the way they've lived their lives. As a strong component of that, Tony, how they live their lives are usually down to the behaviours that they've created, mainly unconsciously, of how they lived their lives. So let me give you an example. I dealt with a head of a very large organization. She was and there's a word for it, and I cannot remember it for now, but there's the head legal person of a huge international corporation. And here was a man completely on the edge. But and completely on the edge at work, completely on the edge when he went home. And so, and this man's looking for answers for me to solve. But as I said to him, I said, look, let's look at some of your behaviors of how you live your life. You go to work, you have an incredibly stressful job. And as a consequence of that, because of the stress from work and the time you've got to spend at work, you've got some relationship breakdowns at home because you're never there. And so you've gone from one fire straight into another fire. Where's the chance that you get just a little bit of serenity in your life and daily? Where do you find the quiet time? You don't. You go from one trauma to another trauma. And that's fundamentally, those behaviors are some of the fundamentals that are driving your sickness. And until we make some behavioral changes on those, we can't get you to where you want to get. And you're going to have to make some changes, and you're going to have to upset that one. Because I will tell you where we'll be in 6 months if we don't do that. We'll get you better to an extent, but we won't get what you're expecting. Because in many ways what we see, and we talked about this, Tony, didn't I? I said that as a very established practice and experienced practice, I'm more interested in who is the patient. How does the patient exist? What is their life like? I'm less interested in the disease. I understand the mechanism of the disease, but what I don't understand is what behaviors drive those mechanisms to be more exaggerated. And until you understand who your patient is, you're never fully going to get the resolving of everything, because you've got to let them know that these are the primary drivers of why they're in the disease process. And until you get the ability to change many of their behaviors, and a lot of them will be unconsciously led, and we've been very fortunate to be able to dive into some of the genetics with regards to behaviors, why people do certain things. And, and that's down to dopamine systems, that's down to understanding serotonin, that's down to understanding some of the neurocognitive genes like BDNF, and getting that much greater understanding is, why is this guy never happy when he's just done a major deal? Why has he got to move on to the next major deal? And the reason is because he has gene variants that mean that he can't celebrate because his glass is always empty genetically. And so some of his behaviors, again, are unconsciously driven simply because his genes are dictating that. And you put those gene variants into a stressful environment, and you see them play out, and you see them more exaggerated and play out. So the skill of a clinician for me, and I never take a patient on unless they have a robust understanding that I need to understand the story behind the story behind the story, because it's usually the story behind the story behind the story that are the behaviors that are driving the illness.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely crucial. And I've learned, as I say, I've seen thousands of patients over many years, and I've made many mistakes on that. And you just get to the point now where you've been doing it for a long time, that you've got to be true to yourself, and you've got to be true and honest to your patient to say, unless you're ready for us to do that, we're not potentially going to get the outcomes that you're expecting. This is not a transactional relationship. I need to understand you. I need to understand how you think on a daily basis. I need to understand the stresses and strains behind you, and understand that. Because if I don't understand you and what goes to make you here on this day, I will never understand how I get you better.
Right.
And so we are less about the disease. We are more about understanding the patient. You've got, like everything, you have to be able, patients cannot come to see us without accepting that they are going to have to make some changes by the way they live their lives. It's crazy. That said, a lot of patients who maybe are new to functional medicine may be getting the wrong view of what functional medicine is. Oh, we'll do these new cool tests. You'll give me some supplementation and you might change my diet and everything's going to be sorted. I would say couldn't be any further from the truth. Although a lot of what you see on social media and on the internet will give you that impression. It's as easy as that.
Yeah.
It's never as easy as that.
No.
We never see that. And so, as you say, there's got to be an acceptance, and you've got to be able, as you say, be honest with your patient about what the journey looks like and what the time frame looks like, and what their role is going to be. Because one of the other key aspects I will say to them is, it's not my role to get you better. You have to be the captain of your own ship, and you have to be ready to make changes. I can't do that for you, and I won't do that for you. So you can pay me as much money as you want. I can even remember an investment banker said that he was going to give me triple the amount of money that I want to get him the results that he wanted. And I said, you just don't understand the process. I can't do it for you.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to do that yourself. I can't do that for you. So no amount of money is going to be able to change what I do as a practice, because you have to be the head of the change. I can't do that for you. And so again, this is the understanding of what is it. All right, Jess, thanks, man. What is it that, sorry, my little son just sent me a message. What is it that is needed from that relationship to allow that relationship to work on a day-to-day basis and on a long-term basis? And I know you're moving into studying coaching at the moment, and the behavioral sciences of it. Absolutely crucial for me. Being able to change people's behaviors are some of the most important breakthroughs that you'll ever make with a patient. It's less for me about what the testing tells us. The testing is a reflection of their genes, their environment, and where their life is.
Yeah.
And so results on a test, no matter how bad, aren't what solves the patient's health.
Yeah.
Understanding why those results are there and what has brought us to this point, and the story of this patient is what fundamentally will get them better.
Yeah. How do you see medicine and the approach to medicine changing in the next sort of 5-10 years?
Well, I think you've always going to have two sides. You're going to have the acute medicine side. I don't think that needs to change. I think it's incredible. If you go outside and get smashed by a car, you're going to want that emergency acute medicine style. And that is going to save your life. If you come in, you develop sepsis, then you might need a week's worth of intravenous antibiotics. They're going to save your life. And so that acute medicine. Funny, I was having a conversation with a pharmacist about this this morning. But even with that, I think there is going to be a bigger thought process that goes around that now. And I think that's slowly changing. So yes, what do we need to do now to keep this patient alive? Well, we're going to pump them full of life-saving antibiotics that save them. But then there's going to need to be a conversation and say, okay, well, we get them through the initial bit, but we just need to think about the potential consequences that all those antibiotics might have done to the microbiome.
Right.
And I think there are signs that people are thinking about that way.
Right.
I would like to think that acute medicine is going to start having system thinkers like myself who would say, well, that's all well and good, but if we've not taken care of these other aspects, this patient may be back with a chronic illness in 3 or 4 years because we never dealt with that. Yeah, sure, we kept them alive, but then we've given them another disease.
Right.
There is no doubt, I think COVID has accelerated people's perceptions that the NHS isn't going to solve all your issues. And I don't mean that from the NHS is a wonderful service, but they are designed to do things in a certain way. And from a point of view of taking care of lifestyle, they're not really set up for it. So what I also think on that is I think we have to wake up and take responsibility for our own health. Now, I get it why we don't. It's because we've been indoctrinated in the system that we go to the doctors and then we go to that and they solve our health. They don't. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah.
You're going to have to look after yourself and you're going to have to spend a bit of cash on yourself. It is what it is. I don't see any way out of that. But what I also see through COVID is that people are starting to wake up, through the trauma of COVID to say, well, I'm not going to be seen for a couple of years here. The NHS just can't do it. So, maybe I need to start taking charge of myself. So I think that's one of the great things about it. So I see system thinkers becoming more and more into very acute care medicine for sure. I also see conventional medicine, and whether that is, GP practices bringing in or having a arm of them where they're sending the acute patient. So we have quite a few GPs who maybe can't deal with really complex cases of lifestyle. And they either give us a quick call and, we're always happy to have a conversation with them, or indeed they send their patients to us. So I think there's more and more, and I think what's quite interesting about this is that, not all the best system thinkers are traditional MDs. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but, I've had 25 years of being able to think in a certain way, and you can immediately sort of come into an acute care situation and go, well, okay, I get that, but we've got to think about X, Y, and Z for this patient as we go forward. So I think it's more and more becoming more normal, more accepted. And I think, again, that is because I always like to start fundamentally from, is the science to back this up? And if there is, great. Okay, so how do we integrate that? And that's always my starting point. My starting point is the science robust enough that this is a pathway you can go down? Yes. How does this integrate into this big system of you being the conductor of an orchestra? And what you're trying to do is work out what parts of this orchestra is broken and not playing great music. And how do you make these integrations, make these pattern recognitions, make these different systems all start to play slightly sweeter music over time? There's a huge role for that. But also within that, that's how I see certainly our group's role. But within that, you may occasionally need the consultant in the woodwind, because there's a few nuances in the woodwind section that you just maybe not understand. Right. Or there's something wrong in the strings and you're going to need to go to the cardiologist or to the gynecologist to say, look, here's our patient, we need a little bit more help on your aspect. And then be able to just continue to oversee things from a point of view of, okay, we've had that done. So how does the music play at the moment? So I do think there has to be more integration, because I think there are some incredibly smart people out there who can be incredibly helpful for healthcare. And I think there's a recognition of that as well, that, you know, I think if you look at some of the stuff that the Cleveland Clinic in the US is doing, you know, you're starting to see very much different medical models coming into what we would consider conventional medicine, and understanding where does this fit within this sort of chronic disease picture. That again are diseases of lifestyle. And you can't solve that in acute care. It's impossible to do. So you've got to have an understanding of, well, you know, how do we take this patient through this process over a long period of time?
Well, Pete, there's probably about 100 more questions I would love to ask, but I want to be respectful of your time, because it's we've gone way over the hour mark now. So if people want to find out more about you, where's the best places for them to look?
Good question. I think very simply, probably our website, Functional Medicine Associates, which I can leave the details on that. I think that's probably the best place to engage us, I would have thought. Yeah, that's probably.
Are you or anyone in your practice active on social media?
We are, yes and no, I think is the answer to that. We it's funny, we're having a conversation about that at the moment about should we become more, we ebb and flow with social media.
Right.
So we do have some social media channels, but sometimes we fall in love with it and then fall out of love with it. So we definitely got a presence. We would if anyone wants to sign up to, we've always been a practice where we've just been in the trenches. So it's not really been as important for us, but we are accepting that, I mean, you know, even after in some degree we've been going 20 years, we still don't have a newsletter. And so we've been slow to that side, because we've been so sort of head down in trying to understand people that, you know, sometimes we forget the sort of bigger marketing picture.
Right.
But we're definitely trying to become better at it, Tony. We're absolute novices at that. So we would definitely like to get better at it for sure.
And just before we finish, is there a quotation that comes to mind that you particularly like?
There is, and it's always for me. So I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but it really is: the shit stops with you. And what I mean by that is that you are the captain of your own ship as far as your health.
Right.
And if you're not the captain of that ship, then I think that, you know, is always problematic. No one else, as you say, you have to take charge.
Right.
And so that's always been I think that's always been my key fundamental in life, is that if you want things to change, you have to drive it. And particularly from the health perspective, because it's a key message that we always say to our patients, is that, number one, you have to be ready for change. And we've got to look at, well, what does change look like, and be, again, when you're goal setting, to be realistic about what that change looks like. But one of the other key lines that I say to my patients is, if I'm having to do more work than you on your file, then there's something wrong with that relationship.
Right.
So yeah. So there are probably a few there where they're some of the key messages that we need to give to our patients, because again, I know you're doing a lot of the behavioural side, and there are sort of there are stages of people wanting to engage in behavioural change, but maybe are not quite ready, and that's okay. We've sent many patients away because they're just not quite ready for what they need to do for the outcomes they're expecting.
Yeah,
and that's okay as well, because obviously we tend to go through stages of readiness for change, and some people just aren't at that stage to do it. And what I would say, Tony, is that when they are, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it sort of is quite smooth. It's quite a smooth process.
Yeah,
there doesn't seem to be many sort of, it's not problematic. It tends to move smoothly because what you're implementing, your patient is doing because they're ready. And suddenly it's like, is it really this easy? And sometimes it is. It's ridiculously easy, simply because they've decided that it's time for change. Right. And they're doing exactly what you're saying. And with that becomes all these results. And so, I think if only we could have a practice where everyone who comes to that practice is ready, because, and we almost think about, maybe we should just have people and almost vet them so that, it makes us look amazing, because, it's easier. It's much, much easier when people are ready.
Yeah.
It just makes the journey so much more efficient, less time consuming, less expensive, because they've done exactly what you've told them to do. And then suddenly, these results are coming really, really quickly.
Well, Pete, I would love to have you back for a second episode at some stage, because I know there's so much more information that our listeners would love that you'd be able to help them with. So,
pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been really informative, fascinating. I could think of 1,000 other adjectives, but it's been, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Next week, Habits and Health, episode 36 with Justin Franson. Justin is an athleticism performance coach, and he's worked with amateur and professional athletes for the past 2 decades, and he's seen athletes breaking down from the excessive levels of EMF from their smartwatches, wireless earbuds and electric cars. And he's tested hundreds of homes and clients, and he sells grounding and Faraday bags at doctor clinics throughout the US and in many other countries as well. And we talk about EMF and the dangers and the problems that it's causing, and about moisture and magnetic properties in the ground and how they repel EMF, and many other areas around that whole topic. So that's next week, episode 35 with Justin Franson. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode with Pete Williams. If you know anyone who would get some real value from this, please do share the episode with them. Hope you have a great week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Habits and Health Podcast, where we believe creating healthy habits should be easy. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Sign up for email updates and learn about coaching and workshop opportunities at tonywinyard.com. See you next time on the Habits and Health Podcast.